The factories are coming back to America, folks. Geopolitical tensions with China, disruptions in the supply chain since the pandemic, all means a lot of those factories that have been leaving the United States for the last 30 years are now starting to come back. And while that does mean a lot of job opportunities for this blurry girl in the background and my man with the clipboard here, it's not all unicorns and rainbows. As you're going to see in some of the numbers, there's a lot of problems waiting for U.S. companies when they try to set up manufacturing operations here in the U.S. Check out this story today in Reuters. Taiwan Semiconductor triples Arizona chip plant investment. Taiwanese chipmaker TSMC on Tuesday said it would more than triple its planned investment in its new Arizona plant to $40 billion, among the largest foreign investments in U.S. history. And this has companies like Apple that are desperate for good press right now lining up to share in the headlines. Here we go. Tim Cook says Apple will use chips built in the U.S. at Arizona factory. Now, we saw last year in the auto market how vitally important it is that the U.S. shore up its chip manufacturing. We couldn't get cars made last year because there was just no chips because of supply chain disruptions, and so the price of cars ballooned out of control, and now the price of cars is overcorrecting to the downside. It's created a big mess for U.S. automakers. And the same can be said for people who manufacture just about anything because almost everything has chips in it these days. And not to mention national security concerns because things like jets, tanks, and missiles are all dependent on chips. And right now, we get most of those chips from Asia. Well, things between the U.S. and Asia aren't exactly simpatico at the moment. So overall, this is a very good thing for the United States, both in terms of high-paying jobs, more manufacturing jobs, resolving the problem of the trade deficit, and also shoring up the supply chain at a time when there's a lot of geopolitical tension. But you see, that's a problem. These iPhones that are going to be made using chips from Arizona, they're about to get a whole heck of a lot more expensive. You see, right now, those iPhones are made by these folks over in China. And these folks are willing to work for a whole heck of a lot less money than Americans are. See, the problem is right now, these folks, they're not so happy. It turns out people don't like being forced to live and work in the same place and not allowed to leave. Workers at the Foxconn factory in China, known as iPhone City, where most of the world's iPhones are built, are doing this right now because although they're being paid, when you're forced to live and work in the same place and you're not allowed to come and go as you choose, there's a word for that. That's called slavery. Something America's favorite virtue signaling CEO has yet to weigh in on. Tell me, Tim, how do you feel about your iPhones being made by slave labor? Of course, that's something that a free and independent press might actually ask somebody like Tim Cook if they had things like journalistic ethics. But you'll forgive me if I don't hold my breath waiting for that. But the real problem here, folks, is these people demand a much higher salary than the folks over in China. And that's not a problem that's about to get any better. And check this out today from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, economic news release, productivity and costs for the third quarter of 2022. Doesn't this sound fun? This is pretty much my day, folks. But the people building that Taiwan Semi plant in Arizona and that big Micron plant in upstate New York, they better read this paragraph. Unit labor costs in the total manufacturing sector in the U.S. increased 5.8% in the third quarter of 2022, reflecting a 2.7% increase in hourly compensation and a 2.9% decrease in productivity. So not only is it getting more expensive to have Americans make stuff, but Americans are making less stuff in the same amount of time. This means those companies that are bringing those factories back to the United States are running face first into a much more expensive labor force, and that means the products made in those factories are going to be much more expensive than they are right now. And that problem is going to get a lot worse before it gets any better. Check out this sentence right here. Real hourly compensation, which takes into account consumer prices, in other words, adjusted for inflation, declined by 2.3% in the third quarter and declined 4% over the last 4 quarters. The largest 4-quarter decline in the series, which begins in the first quarter of 1948. Which means when you adjust for inflation, the amount of money these people are actually making, i.e. the standard of living that these people are enjoying, is right now declining at a faster rate than it ever has, going all the way back to 1948. That's only a few years after the end of World War II, folks. This is going way back here. So that means right now the standard of living of people who work in manufacturing in the United States is rapidly declining, even though the amount being paid to them is rapidly increasing, and the amount of productivity we're getting out of them is rapidly decreasing. That means it's going to get a lot more expensive if you want to keep these people on the job, even though the amount of stuff you're getting out of them is going down. And you can see that clear as day in this chart right here. This is United States non-farm unit labor cost. This is the unit cost of manufacturing goods in the United States. And you can see this has been on the rise ever since day one, all the way back here in 1948. Now, we had the high inflation of the 1970s, and that saw a very steep increase in the unit labor cost. As the inflation of the 1970s increased the cost of living and people started to demand a higher wage, the unit labor cost started to rise dramatically. Now, the inflation of the 1970s is one of the things that really contributed to this offshoring or outsourcing of manufacturing. That's when all the factories in the United States started shutting down. That's when terms like the Rust Belt came into existence, as manufacturing in the United States became too expensive and factories started to move over to Asia. Well, that started in the 1980s and it ran all the way through into the early 2000s. Now, you can see that did level off the growth in this chart. It slowed the rate of increase, but the rate continued to increase. Well, check out what's happened just in the last couple of years. This line has started to go vertical again, just like it did in the 1970s. Now, this is happening right at a time when all the factories are about to start coming back. So it's going to be a reversal of the trend that kept this chart lower through the last couple of decades. Now it's going to be pulling this chart higher. So the unit labor costs of manufacturing in the United States is about to blow out vertically. Now, that's very good news for people who work in manufacturing. That means very high-paying jobs. But that's very bad news for people who are trying to get cheaper stuff when they go shopping at Walmart. Goods manufactured in America are going to be drastically more expensive than goods manufactured in China. This chart right here is going to be an inflationary force on manufactured goods here in the United States for years, maybe even decades to come. This is not something that's going to be corrected by a 50 basis point rate hike or a 75 basis point rate hike. This is the tide coming in. The Federal Reserve, in fighting inflation right now, is swimming against that tide. And again, this is something that's going to take years, maybe even decades to play out. Another thing you have to think about, folks, is that America, we kind of forgot how to build things. See this giant chip factory that they want to build in the desert? Well, what happens if somebody finds an endangered nematode that lives in the middle of that desert? Well, that's when these guys start showing up. Now, these are the Just Stop Oil people. They're British, but I use them as an example. Before you build that massive multi-billion-dollar factory, providing much-needed jobs for tens of thousands of people and securing vital economic and national security interests, you better run that past the pink hair committee chair here, because if they find that endangered nematode there, you better bet the wackos are going to come out of the woodwork and they are going to slow everything down, because these folks are lawyered up and they know how to make a project more expensive. That's something people operating factories in China do not have to contend with. By the way, you see Smiley sitting right here? Pretty sure she was the original sit-in model for the hair covering face emoji. Yeah, better get her permission before you build that multi-billion-dollar factory. And it's because of those people that you tend to have 5 or 6 of those guys with the clipboard standing around at any factory in the United States for every blurry girl in the background that's actually making something. Compliance in the United States, the burden of regulation and environmental laws will slow everything down and drive the cost up. By the way, that's another reason why I know this is a stock photo and not an actual picture taking in an actual factory. You see blurry girl in the back wearing the white hard hat? Yeah, her hard hat should be yellow. Any industrial facility I've ever been in, it's the folks with the yellow hard hats that actually do all the work. And you see homeboy with the clipboard here? He should be in the white hard hat. It's usually the guy with the white hard hat that's saying, my paper says you're doing this wrong. I better make a note in my report. So long story short, folks, while it's very important that we build facilities like this, we need to start making things in America again. We cannot rely on China for pretty much anything. They're not our friends. They've proven that time and time again. And while I'm not a proponent of banging the war drums and rushing off to war, I certainly am not a proponent of relying on the Communist Party for vital supplies that are needed for our economy. So I'm encouraged to see these factories built, but you have to keep in mind that the iPhones Tim Cook says he's going to build in that factory are going to be way, way more expensive than the iPhones built in China. And that means inflationary forces that are going to be pushing prices higher for years, maybe even decades to come. Till next time, live small and dream big.